It started on a warm evening in London after the negotiations had ended. The city was wrapped in a peaceful hush, but in my chest everything felt far from calm. I remember the moment like it was yesterday, the way Hamzat stood at the door of my hotel room, his sharp suit and dark eyes burning with unspoken thoughts. "Auntie Aisha, you look like you need a drink," he said, his voice smooth like silk. I smiled, hiding the nerves that made my skin tin. Hamat, my stepson, the son of the man who had taken me from Nigeria to live in this cold, distant place, but even with his blood running through his veins, there was something about him, something different, something that kept pulling me in. At first I convinced myself that I was just being silly, but the feelings kept growing. I thought about his smile, the way his lips curved up when he saw me across the room. I thought about the times I caught him looking at me, not like a son should, but like a man would look at a woman. It was dangerous, I knew it, but there was no turning back. That night, after a few drinks, the air between us thickened. His eyes locked with mine, and in that moment I knew we were about to cross a line neither of us could erase. "Let's go for a walk," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Outside, the night was cool, the city lights blinking like stars, but I felt hot, like fire was rising inside me, threatening to consume me whole. It was no longer a matter of choice, it felt like destiny, and as he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. It was wrong, I knew it was wrong, but I wanted it, I wanted him. And in the silence of that night, in the shadows of the city, something changed between us. We walked through the quiet streets of London, the world around us asleep, yet in my chest my heart was racing like the beat of a drum at a village festival. His hand felt warm, strong, and his touch sent sparks through my body. "Auntie Aisha," he said again, his voice soft but full of meaning, "why do you always call me Hamzat, like I'm just your stepson? Don't you see me ask something more?" The question hung in the air like the smoke from a burning candle, and I didn't know how to answer. How could I admit that the boy who called me auntie was now a man who made my heart ache with longing? How could I tell him that every glance he gave me made me feel things I'd buried deep inside? But I didn't answer. I just stood there, feeling the cold air and trying to soothe my breath. His face was inches from mine now, and I could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating of him. For a long moment we didn't speak, just stood there, both knowing what was happening, but neither of us willing to break the silence. Then he moved closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "I've wanted this, Aisha, for so long," he whispered, sending a chill down my spine. His words stirred something inside me, something I couldn't control. The woman in me wanted to pull away, to shout that this was wrong, that I was married to his father, but the desire inside me felt like an uncontrollable force. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine, gentle at first, tentative, like he was waiting for me to stop him, but I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. My mind screamed at me, warning me about the consequences, but my body, my heart was drowning in the moment. I kissed him back, my fingers gripping his shirt as though holding onto the edge of a cliff. When we finally broke apart, breathless and shaking, he looked at me with eyes that held more than just desire. There was something darker there, something that made me wonder if we'd crossed the line neither of us could ever return from. "Aisha," he said again, his voice hoarse, "what happens now?" I wanted to run, to leave and never look back, but instead I reached for him again, pulling him closer. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling, "but I don't want this moment to end." And so we stood there, two people who should have never been in this position, lost in a dangerous dance of passion and guilt. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and by morning, nothing felt the same. I woke up with a heavy heart, my mind racing with what we had done, the lie I just told my husband, the betrayal, but in my heart something told me it wasn't over. Yet the morning light was unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across the room. As I slowly opened my eyes, my head felt heavy, like 1,000 thoughts had come rushing in, drowning me in a sea of guilt and confusion. Beside me, Hamzat was still asleep, his arm dripped lazily over my waist. I didn't move, didn't dare to. The quiet seemed to mock me each second, stretching longer than the last. How had I let it get to this point? How had I let myself be pulled into a web of lies, a mess of emotions I couldn't untangle? My husband Sue was miles away, handling delicate negotiations back in Abuja, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his own home. I felt my chest tighten just thinking about him. He was a good man, an honorable man, and yeah, I was tangled in the arms of his son, his own flesh and blood, I had to leave. I told myself I had to push him away, but when I shifted slightly I felt her grip tighten, pulling me closer to him. It was as though he wasn't going to let me escape so easily. His lips brushed against my shoulder and I froze. Auntie Aisha, Imad, his voice thick with sleep, but heavy with meaning. What happens now? I closed my eyes, heart pounding as his hand traced gentle circles on my back. This wasn't just a simple mistake anymore. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was real. I pulled away, gently, not wanting to wake in completely. My thoughts were racing, my emotions all over the place. What was I supposed to do? I had tried so hard to keep the distance between us, to protect both of us from the temptation, but in a city so far from home, with nothing but the quiet heart of the world around us, we had both fallen into something we couldn't control. I stood up from the bed slowly, my bare feet touching the cold floor. I looked down at him as he slept, his face relaxed and peaceful. He looked nothing like the man I had betrayed my husband with. In his sleep he was just hands at my stepson, but when he woke he would remember everything, and so would I. I turned away, trying to gather myself. My hands trembled as I reached for my clothes, dressing quickly as though the mere act of moving would shielded me from the storm inside. When I finished I turned back to Hamzat. He was awake now, watching me with those deep knowing eyes. His expression was soft, almost too soft. "You can't just walk away from this, Aisha," he said quietly, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it hope? Was it fear? I know, I whispered, my voice shaking. "But I have to." This I shook my head, my breath catching in my throat. "This was a mistake." "A mistake?" He sat up, the bed creaking under his weight. He looked her, but there was something dangerous in the way he looked at me, something possessive. "You think it was just a mistake?" I couldn't answer him because deep down I knew it wasn't just a mistake. It was something more, something I didn't have the strength to face. My heart was torn in two and each piece was pulling me in different directions. "I can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and then I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door his voice stopped me. "Auntie Aisha, don't you love me?" he asked, his words full of a quiet desperation that hit me harder than anything else. "Don't you feel anything for me?" I froze, my hand on the doorknob, my heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time I realized that maybe this wasn't just about a fleeting moment of passion. Maybe there was something deeper between us, something I couldn't name but that I couldn't ignore. But I couldn't look back at him. I couldn't. "I don't know what I feel," I finally said, my voice barely audible. "But I can't keep doing this." I opened the door, stepping out into the cold hallway, feeling the weight of my own heart pulling me in a direction I wasn't sure I was ready for. The hallway was cold, the silence of the hotel pressing in on me like a heavy weight. I walked down the narrow corridor, my mind racing. How had I let myself get here? How had I lost control, knowing that every step I took was pulling me further into the depth of something I knew was wrong? I stopped at the elevator, my reflection staring back at me from the polished metal. I looked tired, exhausted. Even my hair was disheveled, my eyes red from sleepless nights and tears. I hadn't allowed myself to cry. I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror, and for a moment I wondered who she was. The din of the elevator doors opening steadied me, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. The ride down felt endless, as though the elevator was taking me deeper into a place I didn't want to go. It stopped on the ground floor with a jolt, and I stepped out into the quiet lobby. The man at the front desk greeted me, but I barely heard him. My mind was still with Hamzat. His words, his touch, everything about him seemed to pull at the very core of me. But I had to remember what was at stake: my marriage, my family, my dignity. When I reached my room, I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in the pillow. The world outside seemed to blur, and for a moment I just let the tears fall. This was no longer just about me. This was about the choices I had made, the lies I had told, and the life I had not on a foundation that now felt so fragile. But as I cried, something shifted inside me. I realized that no matter how strong the temptation, no matter how convincing the emotions, I was the only one who could take control of my life. I had allowed myself to be swept away by something dangerous, but I wasn't a victim. I had the power to choose, to change, to Rebuild later. That evening I called my husband, his voice on the other end of the line was warm and reassuring like it always was, but this time I felt the weight of my guilt more than ever, so I said, my voice stick with emotion, I need to talk to you about something, it's important. There was silence on the other end and I knew he could sense the seriousness in my voice. Of course, Aisha, what's wrong? I stopped, swallowing hard. I need to tell you the truth, there's something you don't know, something I regret deeply. I could feel the tears welling up again, but this time I was ready to face them. I had to confront my mistakes, and in that moment I realized something that I hadn't before. My love for Soul was more important than any fleeting passion, more valuable than any temptation. It wasn't easy admitting my betrayal wasn't something I was proud of, but it was the first step in healing the wounds I had caused. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep running from the truth. And as I ended the call with Sue, a deep sense of relief washed over me. I had faced the hardest part, the truth. I had been weak, but now I was strong enough to rebuild my life. Advice for women: ladies, sometimes the heart leads us down paths we never thought with walk. Temptation is real and the heart can deceive us, but no matter what, always remember that your what isn't tied to a moment of weakness, a mistake, or a wrong turn. You have the strength to rise, to choose what's best for you and for those you love. The truth may hurt, but it's the only way to heal. Never let guilt or shame define you. You can always start over, and you are always worthy of love, respect, and the peace that comes from honesty. And never be afraid to choose the right path, even if it means facing the hardest truths. English, auto-generated. It's